I'll never forget, it was on my birthday. I got a telegram from the prosecutor. It said, come into our office. And I thought, oh boy, this is the time that they finally are going to send me away. And I opened it up and it said, you're no longer a suspect in this crime and you're free to travel. So that was great.
Jeez. Yeah, it had to have been a massive relief.
And I had this job at the record company. And I was always worried I was going to lose that job because they were going to find out, wait, you've been in a massive diamond scandal? What is this with this guy? You know?
Honestly, lucky social media wasn't a thing then. It would have been much easier to uncover. And let's talk about getting hired as an accountant for Polygram.
Yeah.
While you're under investigation.
While I'm under investigation, yes.
So you get hired because you've
Not the kind of thing you bring up in a job interview, you know?
Benztown president Dave Chachi Dennis loves radio and all of his radio friends.
Hey, Chachi.
Hey, everybody.
Because Chachi loves everybody.
My next guest is the first American to head up a record label in Russia. Growing up on a farm in Ohio during the Cold War, he had many reasons to fear the Russians, and yet he ended up living in Moscow for years, running Universal Music Russia. His mission was to build bridges between the U.S. and Russia, and when he arrived, Americans were welcomed under President Yeltsin. He fought record piracy, which accounted for 90% of album sales in the former Soviet Union. He dealt with gangsters, oligarchs, the Russian military, and was accused of a crime he didn't commit, which almost landed him in Siberia. Please welcome David Junk, author of the new book, Rockin the Kremlin. David, thank you for bearing through that intro from me, man.
No. Thank you, Chachi. Thank you.
It's also, I need to introduce Fred Bronson, which is such an honor to have you here. Fred is a dear friend, a tremendous author, and the author of Rockin the Kremlin, along with David Junk. So thank you for joining us, Fred.
I am so glad you're having us here. Thank you. Thanks, Chachi.
David, tell me a little bit about growing up as a kid in Ohio.
Well, you know, it was Ronald Reagan's America. When I was growing up, it was the height of the Cold War. You know, I was a farm boy. I grew up on a livestock and grain farm in southeast Ohio, really central Ohio. And I grew up really, really worried about nuclear war. We all did when we were young kids then. You know, we practiced the drills, heading to the fallout shelter, you know, putting your head between your knees and kissing your butt goodbye, basically.
I remember that, and we'd get under our desk. I'm not sure what a desk was supposed to do, but
there was no surviving a nuclear war. I don't know why they even ran us through those drills. I think they wanted to fool us into thinking we could somehow survive it. But there was no surviving MAD. They called it MAD, Mutually Assured Destruction.
Were you a big fan of music as a kid?
Oh, yeah. Well, you know, being on a farm, you know, my nearest neighbor was, you know, a mile away, right? So, you know, there's not a lot of hanging out with the neighborhood kids. There's not the kind of stuff you do as a city kid, going and playing pickup basketball in the center of town or anything like that. So I spent a lot of time on tractors and on combines and farm machinery alone, you know, and or feeding cattle or feeding pigs or whatever. And so I had a lot of time alone, and I listened to radio a lot. And this is the mid-1970s, late 1970s, where FM radio, you being a radio man, that would certainly bring back memories, really came into full force, and rock music, classic rock, was the most popular genre of music played on FM radio, at least in the Midwest where I was.
And at that point, it was current music. It wasn't
I keep saying classic rock, but at the time, Cheap Trick at Budokan was a new album.
Totally.
You know?
Totally. What a great era to grow up.
Yeah.
I mean, short of obviously being fearful of the Cold War and us, you know, God forbid, going through like a nuclear holocaust, which was really something we thought about. It seems like a pretty idyllic childhood.
Yeah. And, you know, a lot of great music was coming out. And that was the era of the super groups, right? You know, Journey and Rush and Led Zeppelin and Yes, and just so many super groups. And I really think that listening to all that classic, I should quit saying classic, listen to that current rock radio that became classic rock, really taught me in later years how to decipher a hit song.
Tell me, you had a love for Pink Floyd, talking about supergroups and amazing bands.
There's the ultimate one, yeah.
How do you go from literally riding on tractors in the middle of Ohio to working in Russia? It's such a gigantic leap.
It's a strange path. I took a very strange path because I'm the person least likely to end up in Russia. I was scared of the Russians. I even remember the 1972 Olympics. I was only 6 or 7 years old, and I remember feeling, oh my God, the Soviet basketball team cheated, and won the gold medal over our American team. So I remember having this animosity towards the Russians from a very early age. And then our area in Ohio is where I'm from, is located near an Air Force base. It's called Wright-Patterson.
Okay.
It's quite famous. It's where Clinton brought Milosevic from Yugoslavia. Although people that came and negotiated the end of the Bosnian War, they brought them to that Air Force
interesting.
base in Dayton, Ohio. But that Air Force base is important because it's one of the main Air Force bases for the U.S. government. And so we knew it was obviously going to be the target of a first strike by Soviet ICBMs, and so if there was to be a nuclear war, we were going to be burnt to ashes. There was no surviving.
Oh, I had no idea. So you were that close, like a strategic command of the Air Force.
Yes. So I was, frightened of the Russians, growing up in that environment. And then when I went to college, I went to a liberal arts college called Wittenberg in Springfield, Ohio, and one of my classmates was, I studied Chinese there, and one of my classmates went to study abroad in China for a summer, and she was on the Korean Airlines jet 007 that was shot down by the Soviets in 1983 over the Sea of Japan. They claim it was a spy plane, or they thought it was a spy plane, but it was a passenger jet, and over 200 people lost their lives. It went straight into the bay. They've never found the plane. It's buried at the bottom of the Sea of Japan, and my classmate was on that plane. So I had a lot of reasons to really hate the Russians growing up. So getting to Russia was a very strange path for me. But it was through Pink Floyd that I did it. It was through my love of Pink Floyd, because in 1990, Roger Waters announced that he was going to perform the Wall album in Berlin at Potsdamer Platz. And when Roger Waters had left Pink Floyd in 1985, he swore he would never perform the Wall album until the Berlin Wall came down. And he knew the Berlin Wall wasn't coming down. So this was a very facetious comment that he's prone to do.
He didn't think you'd have to.
He did not think he'd have to do that. And he was actually annoyed that people were always asking him, when's the band getting back together? When are you going to perform the Wall album again? So, so he just flippantly said, when the Berlin Wall comes down. Well, when it came down, he kept his promise. And he staged the biggest concert in the history of Europe right there at the Berlin Wall. And without the band, he didn't get David Gilmour or Nick Mason or Richard Wright to perform. He invited Cyndi Lauper. She performed Another Brick in the Wall. He invited Van Morrison. He sang Comfortably Numb. He invited the Scorpions,
what an incredible show!
Yeah, the band, all kinds of artists, and he staged that concert there, and I had to go. I was living in Columbus, Ohio at the time, and I heard it on the radio, my favorite rock radio station, QFM 96, WLVQ FM 96. I have to say the call letters.
I love that. This podcast,
radio people.
That's exactly right. This podcast is mostly radio people, but you are adjacent with the music business, and I find this such an incredible story. And we're going to get into the book here towards the end of the podcast that you and Fred wrote. But thank you for all this pre-story here.
And radio is a big reason why I ended up in Russia. My love of music and my love of radio. And when I heard the announcer say, Roger Waters will be performing the Wall concert in Berlin this summer, I was there. I'm the biggest Pink Floyd fan ever. I didn't get to see them when they performed in New York and LA, the only two cities in America where they actually staged the concert back in 1980. So I put together my backpack and I went over to Europe, went straight to Berlin to see this big rock concert. This was the biggest thing in the world for me. And it just happened to be when freedom was breaking out in Eastern Europe. That's when the Berlin Wall came down and all these new countries were experiencing capitalism for the first time and democracy for the first time. And I got the fever. I just realized this is the most exciting place on earth. The concert was great. The concert was, I'll never forget the concert, but it was just being with hundreds of thousands of newly liberated Eastern Europeans in that market, in that square in that Potsdamer Platz. That's
That era, that concert, what was happening geopolitically, it really was just like a perfect storm. You know, hearkening back to you being in Ohio and growing up on a farm, what are your parents thinking of this? You wanting to now move to Russia and being enamored with that lifestyle and what was happening?
Fear. That's what they were
I
thinking.
bet.
Fear.
I bet.
Crazy. This is insane. What are you doing? What are you thinking? And then they probably thought I was a spy.
Really?
Yeah, it's one of the weird stories of my life, but there's not a lot of people in Ohio that speak Russian, right? Not a lot of farm boys, for sure, that speak Russian. It's a strange path. And like I said, in college, I studied Chinese. So you combine Chinese and Russian, and people begin to suspect I'm up to something.
But you just have an interest in international affairs.
I think it's because I was growing up on a farm. I wanted to see the world. You know, I was eager to leave the farm and explore. And that was my motivation.
Walk me through your first gig. You actually work for a Russian diamond company.
Yes. Yeah, that was a wrong turn. That was a really, really wrong turn. I was fresh out of school, business school, and very eager to work in Russia.
And to clarify, you finished your school here in the States, or did you go to school?
in San Francisco.
Okay, got it. So you came back after watching...
Yes. So when I came back from the Pink Floyd show in Berlin, I realized I have to learn Russian if I want to come back to Eastern Europe, because like English is the language of business here in the Western world, Russian was the language in the Eastern world, at least Eastern European. And
sure.
They didn't have a choice. They had to learn Russian growing up. The Soviets
superpower.
Yeah.
Understood.
So I knew I needed to come back to America and learn Russian, and the best place for me to do that was in San Francisco, because more Russians had immigrated to San Francisco than to any other city in America. And it was just the perfect environment for that sort of thing. So I studied a little bit of Russian, and I got a business degree, and I was really desperate to get back there. I sent my resume to some accounting firms, because I learned accounting. That was my specialty. And I sent my resume to some accounting firms in Moscow, some American accounting firms. And one of them had a new client called Golden ADA. It was a new company. It was a Russian diamond company. And there was a client that needed some help in their accounting department. So I got the job. And they were based in San Francisco and in Moscow. So they sent me to their Moscow office to be in charge. You know, I'm literally one day I'm a broke student living in San Francisco, barely able to pay the rent. The next I'm a CEO of an office in Moscow. It was really quite a stunning change. But I did it, and as it turns out...
You're married at the time?
I met my wife, my future wife, in that diamond company in Moscow. She was my translator.
Got it. So you get hired you're now in Moscow, which I've never been before, but I hear it is you walk around Moscow and it feels very powerful. It's almost like this overwhelming, much like DC is here in the States.
Very much. If government in America is in DC and business is in New York City and entertainment is in Hollywood, in Moscow it's all together. All one place, one city. You've got all the power, all the money.
It's an intimidating city.
It's intimidating, and it's built that way because the individual is not the key. It's the city, it's the people, it's the state. The state is the key, not the individual. So you have these massive boulevards and gigantic buildings, and not necessarily convenient for people, but just an expression of Russian power.
Right, sure. It's a showpiece.
Exactly.
It's a showpiece. Exactly. So what's it like when you find out you get this gig and you're walking in, and I believe it's like in the nicest building or one of the nicest buildings in all of Moscow, correct?
Yeah. I'm
in your early 20s?
I'm scared. Yeah, I'm young, fresh out of school. I'm scared. You know, I'm suddenly asked to be in charge of an office full of 40 Russians. And they don't know if I've come to spy on them or to help them, lead them, or what. They don't know if to trust me or not. And I was the first American they had met, and I hadn't met a lot of Russians by that time either. You know, so it was really a culture clash right there at the very beginning. But they trusted me, and I made a smart decision. I decided I wanted to get their trust. I worked hard to gain their trust. And I wanted them to accept me as, as a colleague and not the American who's come to manage us or spy on us or control us.
Run down for me the diamond business. Are your customers like jewelry stores, or who are you selling?
No, this is much bigger. This is actual diamonds in the ground.
Oh, it's like mining.
Yes. So there's a myth, Chachi, that diamonds are rare. They're not rare. They're very abundant and plentiful, but they're just in the ground. And the majority of the diamond supply in the world is underneath the tundra in Siberia, deep beneath. And it's very expensive to get it out, right? And to mine it and polish it and cut it. It costs a lot of money to build that kind of industry. And the Soviet Union never was able to do that. And the South African diamond cartel called De Beers, who control the world's supply of diamonds, they paid the Soviets to keep the diamonds in the ground. They wanted them to stay right where they are.
To limit supply.
Exactly.
Oh, that's fascinating.
And elevate the price. So when the Soviet Union collapsed, it was broke. And Boris Yeltsin was trying to keep his government together. He was the new president of Russia. Mikhail Gorbachev was gone. And Russia was out of money. And they knew they had this diamond contract that they were getting about $4 billion a year from De Beers. But they were sitting on the world's largest supply of diamonds. So they thought, what should we do? Should we pull the diamonds out of the ground? No, that takes too much money, but we should pretend that we're going to do that to scare De Beers so that they give us more money to keep them in the ground. So it was they call it Potemkin Village in Russian. It's when they create a complete facade just to fool somebody. They did that to a czar. She was going down the riverbank. This is in the 18th century. They wanted the empress of Russia, Catherine II, to believe that things were going well in the countryside. So they literally built a fake city on the riverbank as her boat was passing by.
Incredible.
And it's called a Potemkin Village. That's what happened with this diamond company. They did the same thing. They wanted to build a fake diamond company just to frighten De Beers into paying more to keep the diamonds in the ground.
And did it work?
No.
Oh.
No, it didn't. Because as Russians do, they screwed it all up and stole from it, and there was corruption involved, and it was a very good idea, but because of all the corruption and crime involved in the whole process, it fell apart. So what happened is the Russian government gave this company $500 million in diamonds and gold to bring to America and use that to start the company. Well, the owners of the company siphoned off about $180 million of that and kept it for themselves and went on a massive spending spree. Rolls-Royce, Aston Martins, Gulfstream jets, properties around the world. They really went nuts with all that money. And De Beers was watching this thinking, this is not serious. This is the Russians, cheating, looting Mother Russia again. So it didn't even really work with the De Beers, but who it did catch the attention of was the FBI and the IRS ultimately. And like Al Capone, who got busted not for murder or robbing banks, but not paying taxes.
Tax evasion.
Same thing with Golden ADA, that diamond company. They didn't pay taxes on any of those diamonds or gold that they were polishing, cutting, and then reselling. And so the IRS came in and raided the factory, and the FBI started chasing down the owners. And it was on the cover of U.S. News and World Report. It was a major scandal in 1998, and it even affected U.S.-Russia relations because the company was supposed to be a shining example of the new Russia, an American and Russian cooperation, but it turned out to be a big hoax.
What a remarkable story. And you almost got caught up in that.
I did, because I was their man in Russia, and I didn't know about the diamonds. I had never seen the diamonds. I didn't steal any diamonds, but because everybody was on the run, I was the last man standing, and so they came and got me in Moscow, and so I was under investigation for a couple of years by the Russian state prosecutor, and they were threatening to put me in a prison in Siberia if I didn't tell them where the $180 million in missing diamonds were.
How do you go through day-to-day life with that kind of pressure on your shoulders?
It's tough because I had a new wife and a new baby, and I needed to, feed my family, so I still needed a job, and I applied and got a job in the music industry. So that's how I got into the music industry. But I didn't tell them about this diamond business, or that I'm under investigation by the state prosecutor. One day I may not show up to work because I'm in prison in Siberia. I didn't tell them about that.
Did you ever think about just getting out of Dodge?
I couldn't. I wasn't allowed to leave the country.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. So I had to stick around.
You couldn't come back to see your parents for the holidays or anything like that?
No, I was under investigation the whole time.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. And you're what, mid-20s at this point?
Yeah, late 20s. Now I'm getting into my about 27, 28 years old, yeah.
And how are you affording like legal representation and
I didn't have any.
Oh my gosh.
I didn't have any. I didn't have any.
Did you?
But I was innocent. I guess I was naive because I thought, come on, I can't go to jail. I'm innocent. I don't have the diamonds. I don't know where I never saw the diamonds. It's obvious.
So do you think at this point in your life, looking back at it, you probably didn't take it as serious as
when I was writing this book with Fred, I couldn't believe some of the things that I had done.
Yeah.
You know, and I really wonder if I would do them again, if I'd have the courage.
There's a naivety, right?
Naivety and just such a burning desire to just do good. You know, I really believed that America was here to help Russia, and this is the right thing, and I'm the right man for it, and I really believed I was doing the right thing.
So eventually the investigator finds that you're innocent, and thank God sees the truth, and you're free at this point.
Yeah, they track down the real culprits, the real criminals, and they bring them to justice, and that finally allows me to go free. I'll never forget, it was on my birthday. I got a telegram from the prosecutor. It said, come into our office. And I thought, oh boy, this is the time that they finally are going to send me away. And I opened it up and it said, you're no longer a suspect in this crime and you're free to travel. So that was great.
Jeez. Yeah, it had to have been a massive relief.
And I had this job at the record company. And I was always worried I was going to lose that job because they were going to find out, wait, you've been in a massive diamond scandal? What is this with this guy? You know?
Honestly, lucky social media wasn't a thing
then.
It would have been much easier to uncover. And let's talk about getting hired as an accountant for Polygram.
Yeah.
While you're under investigation.
While I'm under investigation, yes.
So you get hired because you've
Not the kind of thing you bring up in a job interview, you know?
You might have seen me on the 6 o'clock news.
Well, you might see me tomorrow on the 6 o'clock news.
So Polygram hires you as an accountant, which you had an accounting degree or an MBA.
Yeah.
And so are you a CPA at this point?
No.
Okay.
No. I was never very good at accounting, to be honest with you. I never liked it. And it was just a very useful tool, you know, to get me a job. But I was never what you would call a good accountant.
You've got to be stoked because you're being a big music fan. Diamonds probably wasn't ever really your thing.
No.
You kind of fell into that business.
Exactly.
But now here you get to work for a massive label. And what are they trying to accomplish at this point? What's Polygram trying to do in Moscow?
So Polygram was the first Western multinational record label to move into Russia after the fall of the Soviet Union. They were the first. And I think the reason why that happened is because of the Scorpions. The Scorpions, if you remember, they had that massive song, Wind of Change.
Sure. And
it became, one of the biggest hits in the world that year. And it's still considered an anthem for the liberation of Eastern Europe. And Mikhail Gorbachev even liked that song, and he embraced it. And he invited the Scorpions to come to the Kremlin and meet him before he was kicked out and before the fall of the Soviet Union. So the Scorpions are there in the Kremlin, and this song is just really changing the world. And Scorpions, their record label is a company called Polygram. So Polygram clearly saw potential and decided, we're going to be the first record company to open an actual office in Russia. And so they did that. They opened one in Moscow, and they had a lot of problems. It was a very challenging situation because 90% of the music market was controlled by the Russian mafia.
A lot of piracy.
There was no songwriter rights. Copyrights didn't exist. Royalty payments to artists, non-existent. Marketing and sales were the kinds of things that could get you in jail if you practiced that. So there was no real experience with the music industry per se. There was no real music business at all when I started.
So you're really having to blaze trails.
Yeah.
And how do you convert something when you're able to buy something illegally, probably for less money than you could? How do you change that? when the culture is just so different?
Well, you need help. You need help from the government. You need help from the police. Because if there's a CD for sale for $2, why would you pay $18 for the legal version? I mean, some people did. Some people wanted the official legal version with the proper artwork and the lyrics sometimes. But, of course, the millions and millions of people would purchase the $2, $3 counterfeit version every time. And sometimes those were better versions. Like if we had an Elton John album, a new album, well, the pirates would take the new album, and then they would throw in Rocket Man and
would they really?
Whatever they want.
You had bonus tracks. Sure, I didn't know that.
Why not? Why not? maybe some other stars too. Whatever that sounds good. They just wanted to make it popular, and they were cherry picking the best songs. So that's what we had to compete with.
What is your day to day at this point, working as a junior accountant or accountant?
No, I was brought in as the senior accountant. The day-to-day role was really twofold. One, I had to manage the finances of the company, but two, I had to report back to my bosses in London, who the bosses for Polygram, right? And some of them were gung-ho about Polygram being in Russia, and some were, let's get out of Russia. What are we doing there? And I had to balance between those two because I wanted to stay in Russia. I wanted Polygram to be successful. But I still had to report to people who thought this was a bad idea, that there's nothing but gangsters and there's no way to make any money. The mafia controls everything. They really thought Polygram should leave Russia. And what I did is persuade them not to, but I wasn't able to. They were determined to leave.
And you were close, I think, to getting let go, correct?
Very close, yes.
And then literally, unbeknownst to you, you find out that Universal goes and they buy Polygram.
A miracle happened, yes, a miracle. It was a miracle for me, yeah.
And you now get named CEO.
Yeah.
So you go from this accountant, and your boss gets let go.
Yeah.
And she didn't know that. She didn't see it coming.
No.
And the next thing you know, you now have a new boss, you were running the whole show.
And Americans were my bosses, and Los Angeles, Universal. And that was a big difference. Because
what day did you celebrate more? The day that you found out that you were no longer under investigation, or the day you get made CEO?
No, investigation for sure. Because I could have been CEO and still in a Siberian prison.
Yeah, that's true.
So I was glad I had that no longer hanging over me.
How old are you now?
Now I'm in my early 30s.
So you're in your early 30s, CEO in Moscow, and this is your dream. I mean, you want to live there. Yeah. You've got family, and life is going well. Yeah,
and it's one of the most exciting jobs in the world and one of the most exciting places in the world at that time. So everything was perfect.
And there's a lot of optimism at that point also.
And that's one of the reasons, Chachi, I wrote the book with Fred, is I wanted to point out that there was a time when America and Russia were very close. There's a lot of folks now who say, America was a sore winner. We didn't help Russia after the Cold War. We forced them to, move towards war and get closer to China. And people blame NATO for all of this stuff. And that's not true. America was there helping the Russians. And I'm living proof of it. And it was the most exciting thing I could do. I was teaching the Russians capitalism and music industry concepts and how to promote an artist, how to develop an artist. And it was exciting.
When you say the Americans were there, in this particular case, Universal sees the opportunity to ultimately sell more albums, develop new artists and so forth. But are they also, they're investing in Moscow, in Russia, with everything from employees to rent and everything else. Right. Is there anything else? Is like the government subsidizing the U.S. government or the Russian government, or is it really just a pure commercial endeavor?
Pure commercial.
Okay.
Pure commercial. No government help.
Got it. And who helps you navigate, though, I guess you, because you've now been there for several years, but you're helping kind of just outline there's different laws, different regulations, all these things that you have to really kind of learn to work around.
Sure. I had a big team. I was the only American. I was the only American in the music industry overall, but certainly the only one in my Universal office as well, too. And I had to rely on my local Russian lawyers, local Russian staff to really help me figure out the laws we had to follow, the laws we needed, the laws that were missing that we needed. There was a lot of treaties that Russia had not signed yet that they needed to. So I needed to identify those and push for that.
At this point, I want to get into some of the megastars you helped develop and discover, but is the label making most of their money at this point selling physical CDs and albums in stores, like we would here, or Tower Records, for instance? Is that how the business was?
That's how, but it was hard because the pirates had 90% of the market.
They were undercutting you.
So we had about 10% of that market.
I see. And so you really, at this point, what do? You develop new artists to get around that, or how do you?
I quickly realized if I want to keep my job and keep the company alive and out of bankruptcy, I needed to bring in revenue a different way. You know, we could only sell so many Elton John and Bon Jovi albums in Russia. Just wasn't enough to justify a full-fledged record company there because the pirates really were controlling everything. So I realized I had to find Russian artists that I could sign to Universal and sell them in the West. And that would be the revenue that we would get inside of our record company. That would be what would keep my job and keep the company alive, is making money outside of Russia and bringing it back. And so that became my mission, to find artists that I could sign, develop, and sell outside of Russia.
And talk to me about your first major commercial success and how you discovered t.A.T.u.
Well, t.A.T.u. was the biggest artist that I had ever seen, biggest band that I had ever worked with in Russia. To this day, they're still the biggest selling Russian act in music history around the world. But they almost didn't happen. It almost missed us completely. I was watching TV one evening, watching MTV, because that's where I always tried to find the next big thing. I was a big consumer of MTV then. And I saw a video of two young schoolgirls on one side of a fence, and on the other side of the fence, their parents, teachers, society. And it was a very provocative video, and you could tell that the two girls were there to upset everybody else on the other side. And all of a sudden, they turn and they start kissing each other. And of course, society is in shock, and that's the video. That's the song, that's the video. And that was a massive scandal. That was a very brave thing that they did, because homosexuality had been a crime in the Soviet Union. There were still anti-LGBTQ laws on the books.
Sure.
It was dangerous to do something like that, but it was so provocative and so shocking. And it was not about the sexual aspect of it at all. It was more about the provocation and showing this is a new Russia. And we've moved on. We've shed our old, stale Soviet past, and we're the future. That's what this whole song was about. That's what the band was about. The producer of the band, he's like Malcolm McLaren from the Sex Pistols. He was always looking for a way to create chaos or
avant-garde.
Yes, exactly. Anything that would upset the status quo. That was his goal, and that's why he created this band, t.A.T.u. And the two girls, Julia and Lena, they were child actors. They had been in show business their entire career. You know, even though they were still young, they'd been working in the business for a long time. And they embraced this role in this band, and they performed brilliantly, and the songs were hits. They were really well done, well produced songs, and it was just a phenomenon. It was like Beatlemania in Russia.
That's incredible. And they were a big hit here, too, in the States.
They were.
And so you signed them, you knew right off the bat that this was something you wanted to do? And did you have support back home? Or when I say back home, here?
Well, I had a lot of resistance, to be honest with you, starting inside my own company, Universal. And I mean, even in Moscow. My team there, I had a brilliant marketing director and a really great team of young Russians helping me. And when I gathered them in my office and showed the video of t.A.T.u. the first time, my marketing director stood up and said, no, you're not signing this band. This is too dangerous. You know, you're in Russia. You cannot do this kind of thing. You know, I had a lot of resistance from the team, but I persuaded them that this is a hit and we have to do it. And we would realize tremendous success by doing this. And I persuaded them. And then I had to persuade my colleagues inside of Universal to sell the record outside of Russia. And they were resistant too. It wasn't until I finally sent the music of t.A.T.u. to Los Angeles and Jimmy Iovine heard it. And that changed everything. He loved it, and he shared it with his favorite producer at the time, a guy named Trevor Horn, who, he produced Yes and Seal and a bunch of big stars, and Frankie Goes to Hollywood, which was an obvious connection. He's actually in that band that had the radio killed the...
the Buggles?
Yeah,
no kidding.
He's the lead singer for that. He produced an English version of this t.A.T.u. album, the Russian album we did. We translated it to English, and he reproduced all the songs in English. And that's the album that you know of, and that's the album that became big around the world and gold or platinum in 27 countries.
Yeah, that's incredible. And honestly, until we were just talking, this is how naive I am or dumb I am, but you're 100% right. I didn't even think it had to have been translated into English, but of course it was in Russian. Even here in the States, something like that was incredibly profound and provocative. I remember it was just in, I think, 96, 97, where Ellen DeGeneres came out on, on network television. Everyone was like, oh my, we wouldn't even think twice about that now, but back then it was a gigantic deal, and people were up in arms about it. So let alone two girls making out in a rock video. I get it. That was a gigantic deal, and it took a lot of guts on your part.
Well, I just wanted to be the first American to promote a Russian band around the world. I really did. And in America. That was the dream, to promote a band in America, because everybody abroad wants to do that. And growing up here in America, you always hear about how the Beatles, the Stones, they all came to America desperate to break through. But when you're living abroad and you are managing artists, you really see how important the American market is. It's like the golden treasure at the end of the rainbow. It really is everyone's dream, no matter what. Of course, you want to be a big star in your home country, but America is the target for every artist.
Absolutely. That perception is, I think, sometimes probably bigger than what it really is, but you're 100% correct. Yeah. People feel like, hey, this is the golden road.
Yes.
Let's talk a little bit, and I'm guessing, I'm not 100% sure of this, but you and Fred, and we're going to pull Fred back into this. Did you guys meet at Eurovision?
That's right.
Stockholm in the year 2000. I started attending Eurovision in 1995, covering it for Billboard. And as you know, whoever wins is the host the following year. So Sweden won in 99. And I'm in Stockholm, and the singer from Russia is a teenage girl, Alsou, who is the first Russian artist signed to Universal Music Russia. And I meet the CEO of Universal Music Russia, David Junk, and we just hit it off. Like you and I hit it off. We were just kindred spirits, and we became friends, stayed friends for many, many years, lost touch a little bit, and then Billboard was having me do a story on the history of Ukraine and Russia in Eurovision after the invasion, a couple of years ago. And I thought, I've got to interview David, because he went to Eurovision representing Russia. He answered my email, even though the address was 10 years old, and we had dinner, and we did the interview, and he said, I want to write a book about my time in Russia. Here we are.
Amazing. And I remember you first telling me a couple years ago when you guys had reconnected. It was a very rainy night, and we'd gone out to dinner with Johnny and Kenny at the Smokehouse, and you were talking about starting to write this book and how the two of you had reconnected.
Yes.
So now Alsou is the daughter of an oligarch.
Yes.
And you sign her. Mm-hmm. And Eurovision, for those of you who don't know, I think it's become such a huge pop phenomenon that most people do know it. But it is probably American Idol on, 10x steroids. I mean, it's gigantic.
It's the biggest music show in the world. 300 million people watching live.
All around the world.
Yes,
Europe,
it used to be just Europe, but now, it's here available on Peacock.
Yeah.
And many countries.
Yeah, countries from the Middle East, from Europe, Australia. It's incredible.
It's a worldwide phenomenon.
And it was around long before American Idol or X Factor.
1956.
Unbelievable. And ABBA, of course, being
1974,
winners.
Waterloo.
Yeah, so some major artists.
Celine Dion when she was 19.
Unbelievable. So, Alsou, how do you first sign her? And let's talk about her father a little bit, and then let's talk about her talent. So talk first about meeting her and signing her.
So Alsou she was 15 years old at the time. Her father, as it turns out, is one of the wealthiest men in Russia. He owns an oil company called Lukoil. And I didn't know that when I first met her. I really wasn't aware. I just had seen her music and her music videos, and I was very eager to sign her to Universal. She would become my first artist, the very first artist I signed to Universal. Because, like I mentioned before, I knew I needed to find artists that I could sell abroad. I needed to take a Russian artist and sell them in Europe and Asia. God help me, America. That was always the dream. So I was looking for artists that would fit that mold, that would be capable of doing that. And at the time, this is the late 90s, you know, Britney's number one, Christina's number two, and it's pop females that are the rage around the world. Everyone's loving pop female music. And I thought to myself, who is the most popular Russian in America right now? And it was an easy answer. It was Anna Kournikova.
Sure.
She just was. Everyone loved her. The girl... You know, she didn't win any tennis championships, not singles.
Yeah.
She did doubles, in all fairness, but she was not a champion at tennis. But everyone loved her. Everyone loved her.
She had, I don't know if it was Adidas or Nike, but she had a shoe sponsorship, was all over TV, print ads.
She was on Jay Leno talking about, I'm just an American girl. You know, she really was endearing and beautiful. And I was a big fan. You know, how could you not?
Sure.
Like I said, I watched MTV a lot looking for new talent, and one evening I'm watching MTV there in Moscow, and I see this young girl who looks like Anna Kournikova. And it's in this very beautiful video, looks more like a film than a video. Really expensive. You could tell a lot of money went into this production. Again, I did not know her father was so rich, but I should have figured it out from the music video. Because famous actors were in the video, and I looked at her and I thought, oh my God, that's a young Anna Kournikova. And so I proceeded to track her down, find her manager. She was living in London at the time. A lot of Russians moved to London, young Russians, to study. And that's why her English was so fluent. She spoke better English than I did.
Wow.
You know. And I found her and invited her to come back to Moscow and meet us in the office, and offered her a contract, the very first Western contract offered to a Russian artist, a multi-year, multi-album contract with all the royalties and copyrights and protections in place. And that in itself was historic, just first time a Western record label offers a Russian a real record contract. Everything was going smooth until it was time to sign it. And that's when her manager told me, well, you know, Alsou's 15, she can't sign this. We need her father to sign this. That's fine. Let's get together and I'll explain everything. And when I met her father, he arrived at a press conference we were having to announce the signature. And that was the first time I met her. And he arrived with a team of bodyguards. I thought, well, that's interesting. And then someone came up to me and they said, you know who he is, right? Because it was obvious I was clueless. And that's when I learned this man is powerful and connected to the Kremlin. And if anything goes wrong with his daughter, he could easily have me disappeared. You know, because that was a very dangerous person. You know, you don't become an oligarch because you're a good guy, right?
Sure. And he's obviously got a very talented daughter. The record starts to have success, and you note in the book, hearing it for the first time on Europa Plus, which I mentioned earlier is a client of ours, and the excitement around all that. And the record starts to really grab hold. And how do you get now to this point getting invited? Do you get invited to Eurovision, or do you compete to get into Eurovision?
Well, every country is different. I think that was an internal selection. That year.
That was.
So she was chosen, and that's how. I mean, some countries have national finals, and some countries just anoint.
Okay, so she's chosen based on her success and probably maybe a little bit from her father.
Maybe a little bit. And one more thing, Russia was always doing terribly at Eurovision up to that point. They had never even cracked. Did they ever crack the top 10?
Not yet.
They were doing badly, so badly that they even stopped going to Eurovision. They stopped presenting an artist to go on behalf of the country. So there was really no one else even brave enough to take it on.
And the country follows this almost like the Olympics.
Oh,
I mean, so they're following it. It's on the news.
It's a great sense of pride.
Yeah.
Tremendous sense of pride.
So now you guys show up, and it's time to compete. And the father's pretty clear that they're expecting very high placement.
Yes.
And there's a lot of a lot of pressure on you.
Well, he said, money's no problem, whatever you need. And so we spent a lot of money on preparing her. We got Pink Floyd's backing vocalist. We got Steve Levine. He had produced Culture Club and the Beach Boys to produce the song for her. We had the best dancers, the best choreographers, the best costumes.
Simon Napier Bell.
Her manager, very famous artist manager named Simon Napier Bell, came on board. He had managed Wham!
Jeez.
In addition to the Yardbirds and T-Rex and a number of other, I mean, he's a legend from the British music industry, but he was now her manager.
So you've got an all-star team around her.
All stars.
Fred, as a journalist there at Eurovision, what's your first impression of Alsou?
She was going to be like the Russian Britney Spears. You know, she had the talent. She was young. She was beautiful. She had a great song and a great production on stage. It's a television show. So she had it all. Now, you want to know how she did?
I do.
I'll let David tell you this.
And what pressure are you feeling at this point?
Well, tremendous pressure, of course, because it was in Stockholm, and a lot of Russians came to Stockholm to see her. And they even had a big party at the Russian embassy in Stockholm. And I remember them singing Victory Day. That's a World War II song that we were singing about for Alsou. So she goes in and scores a victory.
Jeez.
So the pressure was definitely on.
A lot of patriotism behind it.
And a lot of pride behind this. And the entire nation was watching. It's a live event, so the entire country, well, all of Europe was watching, but all of Russia for sure was watching.
And the winners selected by judges plus people voting?
So it's changed over the years. There is public voting and a jury. But 2000, I believe, they originally only had juries. Once the technology developed where you could have telephone voting, that year it was only telephone voting. So it was only the public voting.
Okay.
And the results come in country by country, and the leaderboard changes. They've got somebody in first place, and then they fall, and someone else comes in.
Oh, my God. It's like watching election night.
Yes, it is. It really is. It's very exciting, actually.
And it's live on TV.
So we get to the end, and
Alsou almost wins. She comes in second. She's winning, and then finally a couple older gentlemen from Denmark with a sappy ballad that I'm a little hurt by losing out to these old guys. You know, my 15-year-old girl lost to two guys combined age 100 years old, for sure.
From Denmark. So
from Denmark.
Denmark wins, but that's the best Russia has done.
Ever at that point.
Ever. And you get back to Moscow.
And Alsou's invited to the Kremlin to meet Putin. I'm not invited. That's okay.
But she's invited. I mean, that's like basically getting a Medal of Honor.
Exactly.
It's a huge state
hometown
event.
hero. And David gets called into the oligarch's office.
Yeah.
And he doesn't know, am I going to be dressed down? Is he going to disappear me? And what happens?
Well, I'm nervous because we finished second, not first, and we spent a lot of money to get her where we were. And I didn't know if her father was angry, you know, or pleased. And his office is the kind of, he's on the top floor of this building, and it's a very ominous building, and they have as tight a security as the Kremlin. And they have their own security team that, you know, could easily take me out the back door and dump me in the Baltic Sea, and no one would ever know. But no, he pulls out from underneath his desk a brown paper bag and hands it to me and says, "Hell of a job, David." And I get home and I open it up and there's $20,000 in cash in there.
Amazing.
So it was a nice little bonus.
Amazing. Not unlike the record business here at that time, too.
Right.
That's awesome, man. Congratulations. Here's a bit of Alsou placing number 2 at Eurovision.
Now I wait in the cold. This is getting old. No more stories, no more lies. Take me off this ride. When you see me in the hole, I look at the wall. By my actions you should know I'm going solo.
Then she goes on to have more success and did a duet with Enrique Iglesias.
That's right.
Which was David's idea.
Yeah.
And how did that come together?
Well, you know, you need to constantly be thinking of ideas to keep them relevant, right? And I had a lot of pressure, not just from the father, but from Alsou's Russian manager. So she had a Russian manager and a Western manager. Like we said, Simon Napier Bell was her Western manager, but she also had a guy named Valery looking after her in Russia. And I describe him, we describe him in the book as like a Rasputin-like character.
Okay.
You know, he's nefarious.
Yeah.
And he's trying to sabotage our efforts because he would like to take Alsou on tour throughout Russia and go to Siberia and Vladivostok and Novosibirsk and, just far away places and go on tour and make lots of money and do that and not sing in English, but sing in Russian.
In a whole different style of music.
In ballads, singing ballads and not the up-tempo, danceable, Britney Spears type music that we were promoting. He wanted her to sing more Russian songs. And he was constantly waiting for us to slip up. Any mistake, and he's taking her back, and they're going on tour, and we won't see her again, right? So there was always this pressure that I may lose my star to the Russian tour.
Right, that's anxiety-inducing. And
Sure.
you don't really know where the oligarch stands with this. He kind of playing both sides?
Well, he always wanted her to be an international star, but clearly he wanted her to be a big deal in Russia too. So, I think I had his support, but I could lose it. I always knew I would lose it, and so I was under pressure to do something. Eurovision was great, but what's next? What do you got next, And so at the time, Interscope Records had just signed Enrique Iglesias, the biggest record contract in history. Ricky Martin had lived in La Vida Loca,
Sure.
so the pressure was on Enrique
Superstars,
to top that. And we got the call in Russia, hey, we're coming out with a new Enrique album. We need you guys to make sure it goes to number one and it's a big hit. And so I took the opportunity to say, I guarantee we can make sure Enrique's number one if he does a duet with my artist. It was a crazy thing to ask, but I did it anyway. And they agreed. And they arranged for Enrique and Alsou to sing a song. It's called You're My Number One. And we released that in Russia, and it went to number one. It was a number one song. And I remember driving in my car to work, and it was one morning, and I'm listening to Europa Plus radio, and the announcer says, okay, for the first time ever, we have a Russian artist duetting with a major Western artist. Here it is. And they played the song, and I had to pull over. Tears were in my eyes. I mean, it was like I was the artist. It was like my song, but it wasn't. It was my artist's song, but I felt that feeling. I finally understand what an artist must feel like when they hear their song on the radio for the first time, because that's how I felt.
And Europa Plus is a network across the entire country, so it's there in Moscow, but also all over the entire country.
Nationwide, yeah.
I think, and I might be wrong with these numbers, but KISS here in LA, I think's got a cume of around 2 million. I think Europa Plus is like 18 million.
Yeah.
So to give you an idea of the size of it, and I might be wrong, let's play a little bit of that song right now.
Bring me on when I'm feeling down. I'm feeling down. You touch me deep, you touch me right. You touch me right. You do the things I've never done. You make me wicked, you make me wild. 'Cause baby, you're my number one.
One of the things I read in the book was that it was very important to Enrique that he did better than his father.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And what was that about?
He wanted to be bigger than his father everywhere, but in Russia especially. And Julio Iglesias was very popular in Russia, but he had never had a gold single, never released a single like we did. And Enrique was very competitive, and he made me promise. We were backstage at the Kremlin Palace when he made me promise that when the single comes out, it will go to number one and it will be bigger than his father, anything his father ever had. And it did. It did. And it would be a few months later, I would meet Enrique at the Top of the Pops, the BBC program in London. And I was so proud to present him with a platinum plaque of his single with Alsou. It was the biggest selling single in the history of Russia.
Love that story. Just absolutely love
And he
that.
beat his father. That's what he wanted. That's what he wanted.
Incredible. So what happened to Alsou's career?
Well, we kept trying new things. The Russian manager was always at bay, ready to pounce, ready to take her back. So I had to keep thinking of other things. And so after Enrique, we came up with another idea. Let's take her to New York and see if we can get one of the record labels in New York to help produce a song or an album with us. And I had made contact with Lear Cohen. He was then the head of Def Jam Records in New York. And I know Def Jam hip-hop, that doesn't seem like that, but at the time they were really trying to sign more pop stars. A star named Rihanna came after Alsou. So you can tell that's really where the direction they were going. They were not moving away from the hip-hop, but they were expanding, using it. And he liked Alsou. We sent him the music. He wanted to meet Alsou. So we brought her to New York to meet Lear Cohen. And as we're in the office talking to him, and he's getting very excited, and he says to her, Alsou, we're going to dirty you up. That's Def Jam talk, right? This Enrique stuff is way too slow, and your ballads, not my thing. We're gonna dirty you up with some of my hip hop songwriters.
Put some grit into it.
Exactly, and get her dancing, and just really, it would have worked. It was brilliant marketing he was thinking of, and he was talking to her. This was so surreal, Chachi. He was talking to her as he's taking phone calls from Jay-Z, because Jay-Z's album had just been released that day, and this is something I observed. It was just amazing. Lear, one of the most powerful record executives in the world, was scared to death that Jay-Z's album wasn't going to reach number one, because all of his previous albums had gone to number one. And if this album hit number two, it's a disaster. And he was really worried about that. But, it reached number one as well, too. We got to see that happen in real time. But he was so excited about Alsou that he wanted to come and see her perform. And she just happened to have a gig at the Taj Mahal in New Jersey, owned by Donald Trump, right? That was his hotel there, right? And Lear picks up the phone and calls Donald Trump.
No.
While we're in the office. And tells him about Alsou and asks for him to set aside a ballroom there at the Taj Mahal so that after the concert, we can have an after party for Alsou, and Lear can meet her father and all the Russians. And Trump did it. He created a buffet and a big ice sculpture in the middle of the room. It was amazing. And we had all of Alsou's family and friends there after the concert. And Lear came, and I was with him, and we even flew over in a helicopter. We took the Seagram's helicopter. It was owned by Edgar Bronfman, the owner of Seagram's. And we took it to New Jersey. We landed right outside the Taj Mahal there and went inside. And it was going to be my triumphant moment, right? Lear meets Alsou and her father. We signed the deal, and Lear makes her the biggest star in America. But Alsou's father was upset at the time because Alsou was being ignored by the record company in England where she lived, Mercury Records. They weren't returning her phone calls. They had just gone through some turmoil. They fired the chief executive there, replaced him with someone else who wasn't as eager to work with a Russian girl as the prior guy. So we were really hitting the wall there in London, and her father was getting upset about that. And for some reason, he associated Lear with the guy in London. And first thing he says to Alsou's father is, first thing Alsou's father says to Lear is, "Why aren't you helping my daughter anymore?" And it just went downhill from that. It was a bad meeting, and Lear, I think, was intimidated a little bit because he saw some of the tough guys that were around Alsou's father. They were, some dangerous East Coast gangsters and tough people from Brighton Beach, and it was intimidating. And
I'm sure that's got to be. And Donald Trump was in the mix.
But even that didn't deter Alsou's father. In fact, Alsou's father said to Lear, if I wanted to, I could buy this whole damn record company.
Oh my God!
And he could.
He could, yeah.
So now you're in the helicopter, right?
Yeah.
And you just see the whole thing tanking.
It's depressing because I'm flying back with Lear and he's not talking to me. He's upset.
Ugh.
And her career didn't take off after that. So it was a missed opportunity.
You were also in charge of working, we mentioned this a little bit earlier, but big American artists. One I want to get into that wasn't big yet, but the first time you hear Eminem.
Yes.
And it gets sent to you,
Yes.
just a white label, right?
Right.
You don't even know who the artist is.
Right. So I had just started the job. I was the brand new CEO of Universal, and one of the things that I was told to do by my bosses is really focus on promoting European music, because Russia's in Europe, basically, right? And so we have all these great British artists, some German artists, some French artists, Italian artists. Let's really push those into the Russian market. Russian kids will love that. My European, so I had bosses in LA and bosses in London, a lot of bosses. But the bosses in London were convinced that Russian kids would love European music. Ronan Keating and Boyzone and, bands like that.
S Club 7.
S Club 7, Sophie Ellis Bextor, a lot of the pop stars from England then. And my Russian team were saying, no. We want American music. We want Western music. We want hip hop music. We want American hip hop music. So, I defied my bosses and I decided to start promoting American music more and more. And it was a risky thing because they were quite upset with me. But I just knew that I would be more successful promoting American music. Then one day, a package arrives from Los Angeles, and it's a CD, and it's white. There's no cover, there's no language, there's no information of it. But I know it's from our Interscope Records in Los Angeles. That's all I know. And I would get those, as a CEO, I was entrusted with that because what it was an advanced copy of an album, right? And I'm there to receive it and share it with my team, but protect it because it could easily be pirated and stolen by the mafia and counterfeit or whatever.
Sure.
So it's still it's a precious thing to receive, but I didn't know what it was. So I put it on, and it was the Marshall Mathers LP. It was Eminem's new album, and it was just a masterpiece. It was just the most amazing thing I've ever heard in my life. And I knew from that moment, this was going to be my breakthrough, and I'm going to make Eminem the biggest star in this country. And that's what we did. We defied my boss's orders and went to the radio stations with this hip-hop music instead of the European music. And the radio stations in Russia started playing it nonstop. It was a sensation.
And the Russian audience, they got it right away.
They got it right. They loved it. And then that actually, the success of Eminem helped open the door for more hip-hop. So suddenly I was selling Snoop Dogg and Dr. Dre and Jay-Z and Run DMC and everything. I was selling Public Enemy. I was selling many more rap and hip hop albums than ever before. Eminem was the breakthrough, and not only that, but then a hip hop community of Russians started to build, and suddenly Russian artists were singing hip hop and rap music. I signed one of them to Universal. So Eminem did more to promote hip-hop and rap music in Eastern Europe and Russia than any artist in history, for sure.
That's amazing. If you go there today, do you still hear those records?
Yeah, absolutely. You absolutely do. It's by far the most popular genre of music.
How important was MTV to that equation?
It was essential. It was essential. And we were lucky to have it because I don't think MTV is as important today to breaking new artists or promoting artists as it was back then. But then it was the golden age of MTV. I mean, it was the era of Beavis and Butthead, right?
Sure.
And not the Jersey Shore. Long before all these reality shows, really ruined MTV, I think. And
core was still music.
Exactly. And the beauty of having our own MTV channel in Russia was that, unlike, a lot of countries, our MTV station was playing Russian music and Western music. And if you were a Russian artist, you needed to compete head on with the best American artists to get your video on air. And so your videos had to be good enough. And that competition made Russian music and Russian videos even better, the competition.
Were you involved, for instance, with Alsou? I'm guessing Eminem would not make a specific video for Russia, but Alsou would.
Yes.
Or t.A.T.u. would.
Right.
Would you be involved in the production of those videos?
Yeah, I mean, obviously we paid for it,
Sure.
and we had some approval, right? We had to approve some things. Some artists would check in with us, some would just go and do it. We'd find out later.
And you said,
So we did our best to try to manage it, but yeah, we were. The videos were tremendous tools to promote the song or the album. They were essential, and I really think what is hurting the music industry today is kids aren't in love with music videos like they were back then. I mean, back then, the top 20 music videos was as important as the top 40 radio.
100%. Back then, they were an event. I mean, when a new video came out,
A premiere, an exclusive.
when you were saying when you got the Eminem album for the first time, I remember having labels back when I worked at Clear Channel and down at KFMB in San Diego. Labels would literally message to you with a messenger, like bring to you,
Yes.
this CD at the time that was blank or was burned but no cover, or, no label on it or anything, and don't let this get out to anyone. And it was this whole real secretive deal.
So
And
exciting,
just
too.
to have be the station to break the record, like
Yes.
you're going to be the first station in San Diego, was such a massive deal.
Well, that's what we would do too. We had the Bon Jovis, the Elton Johns, the Stings, their videos, right? And MTV desperately wanted that.
Yeah.
But I also had new artists, brand new artists that no one has ever heard of. And it's harder to get a new artist in rotation than an established one. So I would say, hey, you want this Bon Jovi video? I'll give you an exclusive, but you need to play this other video from my new
Packaging.
band.
Did the stations come to you? Like, I know Europa Plus puts on a huge concert every year. Would they come to you for artists as well?
Oh, sure.
Okay, so
Yeah.
you would do that.
Yeah.
Would you spend quite a bit of time on the road outside of Moscow, going into other cities?
Some, I certainly have visited a lot of cities in Russia, but because all of the business was in Moscow, almost everything was in Moscow.
see.
I spent by far the majority of the time there.
While we're talking about artists, talk to me a little bit about Marilyn Manson.
Ooh. This is the story the publisher didn't want to put in the book, remember?
But we did.
But we did. We wrote it anyway. One of the things about being CEO of a record label is you don't get to choose what artists you work with, right? You choose what artists you want to sign, what local artists you want to sign, but when you're in charge of promoting international artists, you have to promote international artists, no matter who they are, and no matter what the circumstances are. As CEO of Universal, I represented not only Interscope, but Def Jam, Motown, the classical music, the jazz repertoire, all of it.
So, I mean, they give it to probably 100 artists, maybe, if you add up all those labels.
Or more.
Must have been a big number.
Many
yeah.
more.
Okay.
Many more. And it was my job as a CEO to determine who would break through, right? And who we shouldn't invest as much time in. And generally speaking, we were right, But when I got news that there was a new Marilyn Manson album and Marilyn was coming to Russia for 2 shows, I knew I was in trouble. I knew this was going to be a real test because he already was a very controversial person around the world. But this was his God's Guns and Government tour that he was taking to Europe and bringing to Russia. And I just expected, the Russian Orthodox Church, the Kremlin, everyone was going to be sabotaging this, picketing in front of our offices. I expected all kinds of problems with this. Because he had, Marilyn had gotten in trouble in, I think it was Detroit. He'd already been arrested for assaulting a police officer on stage. And the stage show, we knew what was coming. It had all kinds of satanic imagery and props and dangerous stuff, and especially in a country like Russia, you just weren't sure what was going to happen. And I really thought, I'd be, either trying to bail him out of jail or with him in jail. I wasn't sure which, but I had to manage that situation because that was my job. And the irony, Chachi, is it wasn't the Russian government or the church that stopped Marilyn Manson. It was Mother Nature that stopped Marilyn Manson. He was coming to Moscow on his tour bus, and it was the Russian winter. And you know what happens to folks when they try to come to Russia during the winter? Just ask Hitler or Napoleon.
Right.
on the highway, there was a massive snowstorm, and his bus went off the road into the ditch, and it didn't overturn, and no one was hurt, but they were disabled for a while, and then we had to cancel the show and postpone it for another day. But he eventually made it to Moscow, and the show went on. But that was my great challenge.
Was there an uproar, or
no?
Ended up going okay?
Funny enough, there wasn't the protests from the church like I had expected. They would do that later, though. Marilyn hasn't been back. Every time he tries to go back, the church prevents him from touring there. So the uproar, the controversy actually happened after me. But still, if it weren't, Mother Nature almost derailed the whole thing, though.
So you were doing incredibly well. You've broken two massive artists. You've done an incredibly successful duet with Enrique Iglesias. You've brought over all sorts of U.S. stars, Eminem and Mariah Carey and Sting, and having all this success. You get promoted to the vice president of Eastern Europe, and you open up offices all over Eastern Europe, including Ukraine. Mm-hmm. Tell me a little bit about that and what's going on both professionally and personally in your life.
It's one of the things I'm most proud of, Chachi, to be honest with you, is the fact that we opened that office in Ukraine, that Universal Music office in Ukraine in 1999. Ukraine has been in the shadows of Russia for centuries, frankly. This is not a new phenomenon. They've been in the shadow of Russia culturally, militarily, historically. There's a lot of things that are Ukrainian that you don't realize. You assume it's Russian. A lot of authors, a lot of painters, a lot of things in culture and history that we associate with Russia that actually came from Ukraine. When I was in Moscow, I decided to help Ukraine open its own music industry there and not be dependent on the Russian industry. Frankly, we thought we'd make more money doing that. As it turns out, it was a bigger deal than I realized at the time. But at the time, we just wanted to sell more records. And so we thought, okay, let's open a Universal office in Kiev. But what we were doing is helping Ukraine move out of the shadows of Russia and develop its own music industry, which to this day still exists.
That's amazing. And its own artistic identity.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
At this point, how many countries are you traveling to on a regular basis?
About 20.
20. And
20 countries,
you've got reps and infrastructure in all these different countries.
Right. We're trying to open little labels everywhere, from Macedonia to Iceland and everywhere in between, any little country.
And what ratio would you say you spent effort on trying to break new local artists versus working big American and British artists?
Well, much more time developing the Russian artists because there's just so much more involved, not just signing the contracts and finding the songs and the videos, but then keeping their careers alive and constantly developing them. Whereas, a big artist like Eminem or Marilyn Manson, they've got teams in Los Angeles looking after them. So my job was really just to take care of their music and take care of them in the country if they came, or promote them. But when you're developing an artist that you've signed, it's a lot more work. I would say 70-30 probably, okay. 70% developing.
And did the label management give you quite a bit of leeway to do that? Yeah.
One of the benefits of working in a faraway, dangerous place like Russia is people leave you alone. I didn't get a lot of visits from bosses because they were kind of scared to come there, frankly.
But you must have been profitable for them, and because they have you opening more, they promote you.
We were. The t.A.T.u. album generated almost $100 million.
Oh my gosh!
For Universal.
That's big dollars.
We spent. I had to pay $100,000 for the rights to that album. So it's certainly one of the most profitable record deals.
Amazing ROI, yeah.
It really is.
So everything's going really well for you, but unfortunately it starts to get more and more dangerous. Yeah. And what starts to turn in the country?
I lived there 15 years and dealt with oligarchs and mafia and gangsters and pirates and a whole lot of nasty characters. But I never was scared enough that I thought I needed to leave and take my family out of there. That was until the terrorism started. And there was a wave of terrorism in Russia in the 90s, but it really got bad in the early 2000s. And it was terrorists from the Republic of the Caucasus, really. The Caucasus is the area, but Chechnya and Dagestan were two areas where the Russian army had just come in and brutally suppressed the local population, and they were trying to become independent, and the Russians did a lot of terrible things that you're seeing in Ukraine right now, very similar. And that created a lot of blowback, a lot of revenge, and a lot of terrorism. The women, the widows of these men that were killed by the Russian army, they became what they call black widows, where they would become suicide bombers. And they would come into Moscow and blow themselves up at an airport or a train station or a theater, things like that. And the Russian security services were helpless. They were the Keystone Cops. They were pathetic. Every time there was a crisis, you knew this was going to end badly, and the hostages were going to die along with the terrorists. And you watched it on TV, too. You could see these terrorists, they were happening so often that you got to watch this on live TV, and it always ended badly. And the one that ended the worst for me was on the very first day of school throughout the country. And in Russia, there's a tradition. On the first day, all the parents come and the community, and they have a parade, and it's a big celebration. I don't think you have any classes that day, but you're more just celebrating the beginning of the new year, and everyone dresses up real fine, and it's a fun thing, family thing. Well, on this particular day, terrorists had decided to take over a small school in the village of Beslan, about a few hundred kilometers from Moscow, south of Moscow. And they took over 1,000 hostages, and they demanded freedom for Chechnya, or they were going to kill the hostages, right? Well, the Russians, as usual, did a bad job. And you could see this on TV. We were watching on TV, watching this unfold, and you could predict this was going to go bad. And sure enough, they bring in tanks and attack helicopters and RPGs and thermobarbaric rockets. We quote in the books, it was not a hostage rescue operation. It was an operation to kill all the terrorists. And that's what they did. But they also killed over 180 children, too, in the process. And I'm watching this, and that was enough. That was enough for me. I have my own family, my two boys at that point, school age. And I decided I had to bring the family back to America. So that really was the tipping point.
It's got to be heartbreaking. Did you have a job waiting for you back here?
No, but I found one with Universal here in Burbank, not very far away. Machete Music is in the Latin music industry, and so I was working with reggaeton artists when I came back here.
And what was that like? I mean, after Russia had been your home for 15 years?
It was hard.
Probably your kids, because your kids grew up there.
Yeah. It was hard. I was much more successful in Russia doing what I was doing. Here, I did okay. I didn't speak Spanish, so that's kind of tough working in the Latin music business. But Universal thought I would fit in there because I was working in a tough environment in Russia, so I might be able to fit into the tough environment here in the Latin music world. And I had some success, but nothing like in Russia.
So 10 years approximately later, you're here and working for Universal. You get an opportunity to work for Gibson and go back to Russia to run their operation there.
Yeah.
Talk to me a little bit about that.
That was fun because I really was missing Russia at that time, and I was not really achieving the same level of success I had achieved there. Here in Los Angeles, and I get a phone call from an old colleague from back in the Polygram days, and he's just been made the boss of Europe for Gibson guitars, and he wants me to move to Russia and open the very first Gibson guitar showroom in the former Soviet Union. And no one else is willing to do it. There's no one crazy enough to sign up for this job. And I do it. Gibson is a lot different than Universal, though. I would say it's more beloved as a brand. It's the most respected guitar brand in the world, for sure. And I've seen musicians with Gibson tattoos on their arms, So the people love that brand and that guitar. So I knew I was really working with yet another iconic American company. But I just didn't even realize how popular, how beloved they were by musicians in particular. I don't play guitar. So that worried me, and I asked Boris, the guy that was offering me the job, listen, I don't know anything about guitars. I know it's a shame. I've been working in the music industry my whole career, and I don't know what guitars our artists are playing or why they choose a Fender over a Gibson or Martin or whatever. But he goes, don't worry about it. You'll figure it out when you're there. What you do know is Russians, and you know how to run a business in Russia. So that's how I got the job. And
this is back in Moscow.
Yeah.
And are you now with the guitars? This is more B2C. This is, you're trying to sell guitars around the country. Not that it labels B2C as well, because it's really at that point was album sales, but it's definitely a different type of sale.
It is, but in a way, I was not really working with consumers, though. The way Gibson works was, and I believe they still do, is they have these showrooms in major cities around the world.
I've been to the one in Nashville. It's beautiful.
Okay, you know, and the point of it is to expose media a lot. I mean, those are really used. Sure, they have guests come in, but the idea is really to have as much media exposure of the guitars as possible. See, Gibson doesn't pay for advertising. What they do is they put a guitar in the hands of a rock star who's about to go on TV or perform on a concert tour or whatever.
Got it.
And it's seeing that logo, Gibson, on TV.
Slash plays the Les Paul. And
exactly. You know. In fact, Slash saved Gibson. He personally saved Gibson in the late 80s when he started out with Guns N' Roses playing on a Les Paul, a gold Les
top,
Paul, because the guitar industry in general at that point was hurting, and Gibson was really hurting. And just the popularity of Slash really rescued Gibson in a tough time.
So, are you there still in Russia when they invaded Crimea a couple of years ago?
Yes. Yeah.
So you're working for Gibson.
I am. And
at that point, you realized it was time to now leave a second time.
Yeah. I was really upset with that. That really bothered me for all kinds of reasons. I mean, morally it was wrong, and the Russians were not doing this because of NATO, and Putin did not want to recreate the Russian Empire. This was just a pure land grab. They wanted the resources, the natural resources in Crimea, and then that's what happened in the East too. This is Putin running Russia like a mafia clan. You know, he can do it because he can do it and no one can stop him. And he's using the Russian army to acquire this. And so that really bothered me. And what really upset me was my colleagues and friends and even my landlord there in Moscow were all, you know, in favor of this invasion, very pro-Russian army taking over Ukraine. And I couldn't believe it. I mean, I naively thought Russians and Ukrainians were closer, you know, brothers almost, like, you know, Slavic brothers. That's a naive opinion that I no longer have. You know, the Ukrainians were very different and not wanting to share in Russian culture, but wanting to have their own culture and their own country, their own sovereignty. And I just was surprised how my friends and colleagues, people I knew in Russia, were so supportive of this invasion. It really bothered me, and I even started to write this book with a Russian colleague, and I had to call it off. That was years ago, but I just couldn't even work with the Russians anymore after this. And so I gradually carved out my exit, and I left at the beginning of 2015.
So looking from an outsider that's never been there before, I saw that Gorbachev died not too long ago. Mm-hmm. And here, when an ex-president passes away, there's a big state funeral, and they're in the Capitol. The body's usually laid to rest in the Capitol rotunda, and the flags are at half-mast. But I guess Gorbachev was buried very just kind of quietly. And he was, for all intents and purposes, kind of ostracized. And I guess some people, like Putin, look down upon him and hold him responsible for breaking up the Soviet Union as we all grew up knowing it. And then you've got fans that are Putin, like your landlord and so forth. And I know it's very hard for people in Russia to be able to speak openly and freely, but what part of the country, or how many people in the country do you think, or what percentage would align themselves more with the way that Gorbachev ran the country versus the way that Putin runs the country today?
Well, Gorbachev is very unpopular in Russia. A lot of Russians blame him for the 1990s that were very chaotic, you know, and there were bread lines and there were gas shortages and there were these wars in Chechnya. I mean, a lot of Russians blame Gorbachev for not only the collapse of the Soviet Union, but just stability. There was just more. There was, even though they didn't have freedom, they had stability, right?
I see.
And the older Russians really are the ones that blame him the most. The younger Russians, I don't think, know enough about him. He's really been pushed to the back of the room and not part of the conversation. He's beloved here in the West. When he celebrates his birthday, it's usually at an event in London or New York or something like that, not in Moscow. And I do think there's a percentage that support his ideas, maybe more than him as a leader. But the idea of a free and democratic Russia, I would say probably 20 to 30% of Russians support that.
Really? So you think the majority is
I do.
pro-Putin?
Yeah. I'd like to say otherwise, but I just don't see it.
That Navalny documentary was phenomenal.
It was,
That was very interesting, but it doesn't sound like he had the support that he would need to. If it was an honest and fair election, probably never would have won anyhow.
He wouldn't have. Because he represents change, and I don't think Russians were brave enough for that. They liked stability. That's the thing with Putin. Putin has always promised them stability. Just let me do what I do. Let me steal what I must steal or invade who I must invade. But I promise you peace and stability. And they're not getting it now. They're not getting it in Russia. And that may be the beginning of the end of Putin.
You go back to Ukraine after they've been invaded by Russia to go see some friends of yours. Did your wife freak out at you? And
quite upset, yeah.
Was quite upset. I mean, that takes a lot of guts. I mean, to go there, I noticed when it first happened, a lot of the big David Muir, for instance, and I think it was David Muir, wouldn't go past Poland. He stayed in Poland because of safety reasons. But you actually went in.
I did. A lot of people still think I'm crazy for doing that, but I had to. I had close friendships, and I'd done so much in that country and believed so much in it. And I had years before that, I'd been on a TV show. I had brought 12 Ukrainian female vocalists to Los Angeles for 2 weeks. We did a reality show and tried to create the Ukrainian Spice Girls. And it was all based here in Los Angeles, but it was on Ukrainian TV. So for a short while, I was a minor celebrity over there.
That's awesome.
And it was great to show off Los Angeles to a Ukrainian audience. It was the coolest thing in the world. But so I loved Ukraine, and I was bitterly disappointed with what the Russians were doing and angry, frankly, at what they had done. And I felt the need to go to Ukraine, and there was a particular day I wanted to be in Ukraine, and it was the day Eurovision happened. So it was Eurovision 2023 was supposed to happen in Kiev, but it happened in Liverpool because of the war. They had to move it. The Ukrainians had won the contest and had earned the right to host the event, but because of the war, there's no way. So it was relocated to Liverpool. But I wanted to be in Ukraine that evening with my colleagues who had worked in the music industry and were, counting on Eurovision. I just wanted to be there to support them. And I flew to Warsaw. You can't fly to Kiev like David Muir. You have to stop in Poland. And I got on a train that's a 17-hour train that takes you right to Kiev.
Are you seeing the bomb destruction?
Yeah.
Do you see the burned out tanks and the war around you?
I saw a lot of that, but the thing that I saw that really changed my life forever is, my colleague said, would you like to visit the northern suburbs of Kiev where the war started, where the Russians first tried to enter the city? I went to see all that, and one of the towns there is the town called Bucha, and you may have heard of that. That's where the very first war crimes were uncovered that the Russian army had committed.
I saw that on 60 Minutes.
Yeah.
Yes.
That church is where they buried the bodies of over 300 civilians who'd been tortured, mangled, raped, killed. They buried them in the back, the Russians did, in the back of this churchyard. And when I was there, I met a frail, elderly church worker. She was working there, and she opened up the church for me and showed me around, and she told me how she had been hiding in the church basement for those 2 months that the Russians were up above just dumping bodies, and she was still shaking. It had been a year since this had been uncovered, the crimes, but she was still shaking from the trauma. And it changed me forever. It made me, more angry at the Russians, but also realizing I've got to do something. I've got to help this country. I've got to figure out a way to play my part, to do something to help them. And I came back and I started a podcast actually about Ukrainian culture after that. Was my contribution. I know the Russians, one of their goals was to erase Ukrainian identity, erase Ukrainian culture. That's one of their main objectives of this invasion. And so I wanted to play my part to stop that. And so I started this podcast by interviewing various Russian cultural and artists, cultural figures and artists and painters and people like that. And
What's the name of the podcast?
it's called Art During Wartime.
Obviously, an incredibly talented businessman, very talented record executive, but you've got a massive heart as well. I find that
Thank you, Chachi.
very inspirational. And this has been just a pleasure. Fred, I get why you did this book.
Yes.
When you first told me about it,
Yeah.
as you know, in all candor, I'm kind of like, I don't know about this story, but it's absolutely fascinating.
Isn't it? It's compelling. I mean, David was brave. He went through a lot of good times and bad times in Russia. Braver than me, I'm sure. I don't know that I could have done it.
Much braver than me.
And it's a compelling story. So I was very thrilled that he asked me to work with him on the book.
You guys have done an amazing job on the book.
Thank you.
And
Thank
it's out now and
It
available
is. Rockin the Kremlin.
on Amazon or
Yeah,
Barnes and Noble.
all of those. Wherever books are sold, hopefully. But yes, definitely those two places.
That's incredible. Gentlemen, really appreciate you guys taking the time to be here. One last bonus question for you, David. How would you like your legacy to be remembered?
Wow, that's a great question, Chachi. That I had a heart, like you said. I love the words you just described me with. That I had a heart, that I knew the difference between right and wrong, and anytime I had the chance to confront evil, I did it.
Thanks for listening to Chachi Loves Everybody. If you like the show, we hope you leave us a 5-star rating and tell your friends. Make sure to follow us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. This has been a Benztown McVeigh podcast production. Hosted and researched by Dave Chachi Dennis. Executive producer Darren Silva. Producer and editor Jake Urbanik. Show coordinator Estefania Padilla. Marketing and distribution Suzanne Alsou and Robbie Gessel.